Let's continue our discussion. This is segment number 2 of Theology and Preaching. And I'm Theology of Preaching, and I want to continue to tell you a little about the story of the beginning of rhetoric. I think it's really a fun story how it began. Before I get to that, I want to just say this is one classical definition of rhetoric from Aristotle. It is the ability to see what is possible persuasively in any given case. And I love that definition. It makes us sound like sort of a secret spy agents or something. We're able to discern right in that moment. It's a very lively definition that we're maximizing available means of persuasion in any given moment. Situational awareness in the field. One of the other points about rhetoric that brings up is that rhetoric is necessary in contested situations where there is a need to persuade others. So unlike philosophers who were simply stating their truths, rhetoric is taking, and they might be writing it down in a book, but rhetoric is taking place in real time. There's disagreement. There's a need to deliberate about something that's crucial, that's important. People's lives are on the line. Listeners have to be persuaded because a guilty person is about to be convicted, or a villain is about to be elected, or something like that. So rhetoric teaches us that language is powerful and it's worth taking time to craft it well. And so it is completely unnecessary in a dictatorship. So we were in Egypt not too long ago, my husband and I, a year and a half ago, and we were telling our young guide there about a program called Youth in Government that our daughter had been in, where thousands of teenagers across America work really hard to debate bills. And he was just mystified as to why teens would spend time doing that, and that it would actually be kind of something that the cool kids do. And I said, oh yeah, they line up at 4 a.m. in some cities to get a spot in the program. And he whistled out loud and he said, you know, that is what we need if we're ever going to emerge from a dictatorship. And that has implications for church leadership, because we do not need to bother thinking about listener-speaker dynamics or carefully crafting language to woo and persuade people with beauty or musicality, or speaking in ways that model and invite to lively engagement with truth, if we're not about forming communities of disciples that are capable of articulating and applying their own beliefs. If we're just going to lead like a dictatorship, it's not necessary. And I'm trusting and hoping that none of you, that's your working model for what you're hoping for in your church leadership. And so you need to pay attention to rhetoric. And in fact, rhetoric was born in the overthrow of a dictatorship. In 465 BC, when the good people of Syracuse overthrew Thrasybulus, they decided to experiment with something called democracy. And guess how well that went? Well, it was a mess. Who's in charge here? Who's going to settle these property disputes? Looting, rioting, mayhem ensued until, tradition has it, one Corax stood before the people and made a speech. This was something new. Well, what was the first thing that he did? What would you guess he would do first? He began, in fact, by connecting with them, by affirming their character, affirming that they were on a good road, trying something bold and good. And then he told their story. He renamed for them where they'd been so far. And he named their moment and the choices they faced and persuaded them to stick it out. And then he wrote about it. He set down the precepts of persuasion that he had just used, and rhetoric was born. Because in the absence of a tyrant, a dictator, there was a need to create laws and to settle disputes. Fast forward a few decades, though, and Athens is crawling with professional rhetoricians called sophists. It's still kind of the Wild West in terms of order in Greece. The average jury size was not a manageable 12, but say 500. And you didn't go on and deliberate. You stood up and you got one shot to make your case. And then there were wild, raucous mobs who would vote. So the sophists saw a market there for speechwriters. And these were in general really savvy and pretty unethical speechwriters. And so the philosophers had a harsh critique. Socrates, Plato said this is just not worthy of our citizenry. But one of the greatest, a little more pragmatic philosophers, Aristotle, said, if we could find a way to have this rhetoric but be ethical, it could be pretty powerful for building democracy, for building and forming citizens. And so Aristotle worked hard to craft the art of rhetoric, and in it he delineated the speaker's 3 persuasive appeals. And some of you can name those already. Let me just briefly summarize. His first, he said, was logos. Aristotle saw that the study of rhetoric is really the study of human nature. He really focused on the listener and looked hard at them and said that when we're listening, our brains are looking for logic, for reason, and for someone who's sharp enough to anticipate and refute counter-arguments. And logic that is clear is highly satisfying. And I think we've seen that in good preaching, haven't we? That when it takes people through a process of discovery, it can be very exciting. And when a pastor's and preacher's logic is muddled and unclear, that can be very distracting to listeners and very dulling to our listening experience. And we certainly see Jesus as a master logical arguer with his use of analogies, causes, consequences, logical syllogisms, and spelling out for people the implications behind their choices and their actions and their values. So logos is essentially reason. Pathos is pathos, you see, pathetic, and it's feeling, it's the heart. And here, I raise the question, is it a sermon if it doesn't touch the heart? And I say no. People often ask me, what's the difference between teaching and preaching? And I think ultimately good teaching will share very much in common with preaching. But I think we can give a good lecture without explicitly touching the heart. But if in a sermon we haven't sought on some level to move people and speak to their hearts, we haven't preached. That's my conviction. So pathos thinks about what touches the heart. And Jesus did too, with stories, with metaphors, with repetition of words and phrasing, alliteration, anaphora is another form of repetition, repeating the beginning of each phrase. Testimony is a powerful tool for touching the heart. The use of imagery, vivid language that appeals to all the senses, those are all things we can be doing to touch the heart. We'll touch on all of that in more depth when we talk about writing the sermon. But for now, I want to show you his triangle, which was the logos, the pathos, and the ethos. And this word, ethos, we can think of it, it's actually not the Greek word for ethics. It's more has to do with environment and relationship and character of a speaker. But it is as much the character of the speaker, it is also the ethos it's almost something in the air between the speaker and listener. It's the goodwill that you are able to establish, which is important to consider for ethos because we can be really kind people and not convey that we're kind because we fail to smile or we fail to make eye contact. And so ethos is all the things we do to actually successfully communicate to people that we are trustworthy and that we actually like them. So, as we see here, Quintilian says that a good orator is a good man speaking well. So ethos is about our character. It's about showing people that you have some wisdom. You actually are qualified to speak on this topic, and showing them that you have virtue, which in preaching we would maybe reword that as holiness, something that God has been forming in us. But we have character. We have integrity to speak about what we speak. And finally, eunoia is goodwill, that we actually have genuine affection and care for the people we speak about. And it is my understanding that each of these we need to be attending to when we preach. And again, if we would just look through a purely theological lens at the dynamics of word, gospel, Bible, and the work of God in preaching, we overlook some of these crucial dynamics. And so I want to ask you, what goes wrong when there's too much ethos? Oops, I'm going to go back. When we're focused entirely on conveying our character to people, when we're focused entirely on our pathos, when we're just pandering to people's emotions, or when logos has gone awry and it's all just head and cerebral. So I'm going to ask you if you want to just pause for a moment and to reflect on what are the problem areas for each of these, for ethos, pathos, and logos. So go ahead and list a few things under each of those. Where does logos go wrong? Where does ethos go wrong? And where does pathos go wrong? But what I'd like to do now, and this will probably be a little longer segment, I'm going to go ahead and go through several minutes now to just talk about theology and why ultimately, as much as I love rhetoric, as much as I want us to work on crafting language well and learning all we can from contemporary TED Talks and from Aristotle and from beautiful sermons that have been written throughout the ages, rhetoric has its limits as a framework for preaching. And let me just distinguish a few of those things. Rhetoric was, they delineated three purposes of rhetoric. Deliberative, what kind of laws deliberating on what kind of laws we should create. Forensic was figuring out who was guilty and so that's courtroom rhetoric. And epideictic, which is praising a hero or sometimes vilifying a villain. But none of those are actually about teaching. And they're mostly just about ideas that are spinning out of the rhetorician's own head. But we're not doing that. We are servants submitted to a text that we understand has revealed truth to us. We are teaching Scripture. We're interpreting texts, not our own ideas, as brilliant as they may be. Secondly, we speak in partnership with God. That's not a category in ancient rhetoric or in a secular TED Talk at all, is it? We believe that God is revealing himself in the act of preaching, as we alluded to at the beginning in segment 1. We understand with great humility and awe that preaching is empty apart from the breath of God blowing into it. And yet when it is filled with his power, we can barely imagine all the good that preaching can do. Thirdly, we understand success very differently than the giver of a TED Talk today who's calculating likes and shares, or the ancient rhetorician who's trying to see if their villain got off free. We understand that a sermon can succeed if it persuades no one. Look at Jeremiah. I think God counted him faithful. And it can fail, even if its listeners adore that preacher and put him or her up on a pedestal. Those don't tend to last very long, and the crash can be very painful. We also understand that rhetoric is calling people to change their course of action, say, take up arms or convict a criminal or vote for somebody, whereas preaching is calling people to change at the deepest levels of their being in reliance upon the grace of God. Finally, rhetoric is actually somewhat elitist. It was a big step to move from a dictatorship to a democracy. But if you know your Greek history, you know that the Greek democracy was, the vote was only extended to educated, landowning males. Whereas preaching, immediately when the church was born, it had to deal with diversity. And so we see Paul's concern in Corinth that those who are not wise in this world are those to whom the gospel has been revealed. We see Augustine taking, not only did he write Doctrina Christiana, but he wrote De Catesandis Rudibus, which I love. It means on the teaching of the rural people, the rude people, no, the rougher people, the rural people, not the educated. He was concerned that his preachers as a bishop took that seriously. And then I love the quote from Luther. At one point, he's just talking with somebody, another pastor, and he says, "We need to refrain from erudite preaching. Good God, there are 16-year-old girls and farmers in church." So this was has been important to the church throughout the centuries. So having contrasted rhetoric and theology, rhetoric and theology do, however, agree that words are powerful. And here I'll just briefly say J.L. Austin has this concept of performative speech where he says that there are certain words, as a philosopher of language, who actually enact what they do. Words like, I pronounce you man and wife. I christen this ship the Flying Beagle. That when we speak performative speech, change actually is enacted by those words. And we understand the proclamation of the gospel to live in that space, that it actually has performative, transformative power, not merely rhetoric's persuasive power to cause assent by logic. And so I'm going to be calling you this quarter to have confidence in the power of your speech to bring about change and to declare to people that they have been set free from bondage by the power of Christ. Just a few other theological convictions as we close this lecture. How are we formed by some of the key doctrines of our faith as preachers? One is incarnation. Incarnation has huge implications for preaching. It means that we preachers matter. Unlike Bart's comment about how the person is not constitutive for the act of preaching, which Bart, he's not quite so severe in some other places, but the incarnation, we matter in our flesh. And so we need to bring our whole selves to this act, offering ourselves fully to God and to our listeners. We should be tired when we're done preaching because we've kind of revealed our souls, laid them bare, and it takes a little process to tuck them back in again afterwards. Augustine put it as strongly as that we are actually blessed, broken, and distributed like the elements of bread and wine, as he's speaking to preachers here. And Barbara Brown Taylor reflects as well on the fact that it is right here in our own bodies, our own witness, that the Word of God is made known. The cross. The cross has powerful implications for preachers. It is our message and it is our power, not our own charisma or pulpit charm, our ability to be persuasive. And it also means that we as listeners had better be judging no one according to the flesh, nor not according to gender, height, ethnicity, or ability to make us laugh or cry, but according to their faithfulness in proclaiming the cross. And we've talked about this already in Luther's amazing belief in the presence of the risen Christ. And Bonhoeffer put it as well, that Christ is walking through his congregation as the Word. Pentecost informs our preaching, the Holy Spirit, in that we understand preaching on some level to be miraculous, and an event of the miraculous is going on. And finally, our doctrine of the church is important to integrate with our doctrine of preaching, in that we tend to think, I think too often today we can think of preaching as this hope, this individual experiences that are created, and often what we hear back from people is, I liked your sermon, but how are we doing it building up the church, forming congregations through our preaching? And just because I've been a little hard on Bart, I will come back and say that Bart had a robust and wonderful theology of preaching. And you will be reading a selection from his book in the E-Reserves readings. And I actually love Bart, and I love his confidence in the power of the Word, his confidence in listeners, and he had just marvelous insights into preaching. And so I encourage you that when you read him, don't be too hard on him. He is a wonderful theologian who breathed confidence into the church in the power of preaching. All right, we will end there for this segment. And my question for you as you end this segments 1 and 2 is, I would like you to reflect on, what do you need to bring in from the study of rhetoric to your own preaching? And what do you need to believe more deeply about God, about the cross, about the incarnation? How would that deeper belief in some of the truths we've just been considering change your preaching?